All right, so get ready because today we are going deep into a really tragic part of Portland's history, the Pomona Hotel Fire back in 1975.
Yeah.
And well, I think we've got some pretty cool stuff to look at today. We've got parts of that Wikipedia article and even a photo of the building as it is today. Still there.
Oh, wow. That's pretty interesting. It makes you think about all the stories that those walls could tell.
I know. I know. That's what I love about these deep dives. It's all about the stories. And speaking of stories, you know I love a good setting.
Hmm.
So, okay, let's set the stage here. It's 1975. We're in Portland, in a part of town that was known as Skid Row.
Huh.
And it was a big one, too, like
Yeah.
one of the largest on the whole West Coast at the time. The kind of place where, well, where folks down on their luck would end up. And the Pomona Hotel was right in the middle of it all.
Yeah, and the Pomona, it was actually, it was in what used to be the Erickson Saloon building. Imagine that.
Ah,
Going from a saloon to low-income housing. It's a pretty big change. You can really see how the city was changing.
totally. And get this, rooms were only, wait for it, 80 cents a night.
80 cents.
Wow. It's hard to imagine, right?
Yeah, especially these days. I mean, 80 cents. You think about how much people were struggling back then just to get by. They had to make some really hard choices.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings us to the night of July 7th. I mean, it was late. I'm guessing most people were asleep when a fire just erupted on the second floor.
It's funny you should say that because the fact that it started on the second floor, it's something people don't always think about, but it's actually really important. It made a huge difference in how the fire spread. And in the end, it was a big reason why it was so bad.
Oh, that's really interesting. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
So how did it spread so fast then?
Well, from what we can tell from the sources, the fire, well, it looks like it was fueled by gasoline.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you can imagine how quickly that would have made the fire spread. I mean, it got incredibly hot, like 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
1,000 degrees. That's just, I can't even imagine. It must have been terrifying for everyone inside.
Mm-hmm. So what was it like when the firefighters got there? What do our sources say?
It was total chaos.
Yeah.
They got there and there were men trapped. Some were yelling out the windows. Some were even hanging from the ledges, just desperate to get away from the fire. It must have been just awful.
I bet. I can only imagine what that must have been like for the firefighters, too, to go into something like that.
Yeah, that's true. It must have been just, incredibly difficult. And, tragically, not everyone made it out.
Right.
8 people died that night.
Yeah.
And then another 4 from their injuries later on. So 12 people in total.
Yeah.
It's the deadliest fire in Portland's history.
12 people.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a lot of lives lost.
Yeah, and it's interesting. A lot of them, they weren't found in their rooms. They were found in the hallways. They died from asphyxiations, from smoke inhalation, trying to escape. Just awful. It makes you think about how the building was built back then. Like, were there sprinkler systems or anything?
That's a really good point. Sprinkler systems, they're everywhere now, but back then in 1975, not so much. Especially in a place like the Pomona, a cheap hotel. They probably didn't have a lot of money for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Crazy to think how much things have changed since then.
Yeah.
But okay, let's move on to the investigation. Our sources say that there was an arrest, and it's a pretty wild story. So who was this John Joseph Newvine guy?
Well, Newvine was this guy living on Skid Row. He was like the main suspect early on. The police, they arrested him because a gas station attendant said he bought gasoline just before the fire.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. And they found a gas can.
Yeah, there was an empty gas can near the hotel. So at first it seemed like they had the right guy.
So what happened?
Well, they ended up dropping all the charges.
What? Why?
Turns out the attendant, he was wrong. He misidentified Newvine.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? I mean, how could that happen?
Yeah, it really makes you think about how reliable eyewitnesses are. People make mistakes. And it makes you wonder if maybe being on Skid Row played a part in it too. It was a place where people were often ignored or stereotyped. Maybe there was some bias there.
Yeah, maybe. That's a good point. But so they found the real guy in the end, right?
Right. Roy Jennings Beard. He was 57 years old.
Okay, so tell me about him. What happened?
Well, he was charged with 11 counts of murder for setting the fire. But here's the thing. Before they could even go to trial, they had to send him for a mental evaluation, to figure out what his state of mind was at the time.
Oh, okay. So now we're talking about mental health, too. That's a whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, how responsible was he really?
Exactly. It makes you think about, how the justice system deals with these kind of issues. What are your initial thoughts on that?
It's definitely interesting. It shows you that even with something like arson, something that seems pretty straightforward, There's often a lot more to the story than you first realize.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the things that makes these deep dives so interesting. We really get to dig into the details and see the nuances of these events. And I think it's important to remember, too, that at the heart of this tragedy, there were real people who lost their lives.
That's right. It's easy to get caught up in the story and forget about that.
Yeah.
So let's take a minute to remember those victims. We have some of their names from our sources: Narcis Spiral, Jose Hernandez, Virgil Howard, Carl Hunsaker, Jim Jimenez, and there were others too. These were people with lives, with families, with dreams, and it was all taken away. What comes to mind for you when you look at these names?
It really strikes me how diverse they are. It shows you that Skid Row wasn't just one type of person. It was a whole community of people from all walks of life, each with their own unique story.
That's so true. And I think it's a reminder that we can't make assumptions about people. Just because they lived on Skid Row doesn't mean they were all the same. They were individuals, just like anyone else.
Exactly. And their deaths weren't just numbers. They were real people who were loved and who will be missed. And it was a huge loss for their families and friends, and for the Skid Row community as a whole.
Yeah, it's sad to think about. A community that already felt forgotten,
Yeah.
and then to have something like this happen, it makes you wonder about the impact it had, on every.
Right. It's like imagine the trauma, not just for the families who lost someone, but for everyone who saw it. The firefighters, the people who lived there. It must have been just, well, devastating.
Yeah, the emotional toll of something like that. I mean, I'm sure there were nightmares, flashbacks, maybe even survivors killed, things like that. It's not something you just get over.
Yeah, and it just shows how important it is to have good support systems in place, not just for the victims, but for the first responders, the witnesses, everyone in the community. Trauma, it's like it spreads, it affects everyone, and people need help to heal.
And speaking of rebuilding, I can't get over the fact that the building is still there. It's been repurposed, but it's still standing. I mean, that's got to be pretty powerful for the people who remember the fire. It's like a reminder of what happened.
Yeah, it's like the building is still there. It's like a monument to the past. Like it's asking us to remember what happened and to think about how we can do better.
It makes you think about all the history that's hidden in our cities,
Yeah.
all the stories that these buildings hold. It's pretty amazing. And in a way, I guess it's a testament to the strength of the community, too. They didn't give up. They kept going.
Right. It's like a symbol of resilience. But we can't forget, this fire wasn't just about a building. It was about the people who lived there, the conditions they were facing, and the things in society that made them so vulnerable, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about how cheap the rooms were, but I think it would be good to talk more about Skid Row itself. What was it really like back then in 1975? You said it was one of the biggest on the West Coast. What was life like for the people who lived there?
Well, from what we've read, it was tough. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of addiction, a lot of people felt hopeless. But it was also a community. People looked out for each other. They understood each other's struggles. It wasn't all bad.
Right. It's easy to stereotype people who live in places like Skid Row, but like any community, there were all kinds of people there with different stories and different backgrounds.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that.
Exactly. And I think this fire, as tragic as it was, it gives us a glimpse into their lives. It makes us think about the systemic issues that contributed to this tragedy and how those same issues are still present today. What are your thoughts on that?
It's true. The things that led to this fire, like poverty and homelessness and addiction, there's still problems today. The Pomona Hotel Fire, it reminds us that we need to keep working to solve these problems. We can't forget about them.
Exactly. We can't just pretend it was a one-time thing. It's an opportunity to learn from the past and make things better in the future. So the question is, what lessons can we learn from the Pomona Hotel Fire that can help us today?
That's a great question. For me, one thing that really stands out is the importance of fire safety, especially in older buildings and places where people don't have a lot of money. The fact that the Pomona Hotel didn't have sprinklers, that definitely played a part in how many people died. Do you agree?
Absolutely. It shows how important it is to make sure that all buildings are safe, especially for people who are already struggling. We've come a long way since 1975, but we can't get complacent.
Yeah, and I think it also shows how important it is to have strong social support systems. A lot of the people living in the Pomona Hotel, they were dealing with a lot of problems. And if there had been more support, maybe things could have been different for them.
I agree. It's about having a safety net that catches people before they fall too far. It's about giving people the resources and support they need to get back on their feet. What do you think about that?
I think it's crucial. We
Huh.
talk a lot about personal responsibility, and that's important, but we also need to recognize that there are systemic problems that contribute to poverty and inequality.
Right.
We need to create a society where everyone has a fair chance.
Well said. And that brings us to another big lesson: affordable housing. The fact that people were living in a place like the Pomona Hotel, where rooms were only 80 cents a night, shows how desperate the need for affordable housing is.
Yeah, that's still a huge problem today. Housing costs are so high, and it's really hard for people to find a safe and affordable place to live. And the Pomona Hotel Fire, it reminds us that everyone deserves a decent place to live. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, but it's something we can't ignore.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that everyone has access to safe and affordable housing. It's not a luxury, it's a basic human need.
I couldn't agree more. What really strikes me is how interconnected all these things are. Fire safety, social support systems, affordable housing, they're all linked. We can't solve one problem without addressing the others.
I agree. And at the heart of it all is the belief that everyone deserves a safe and stable place to live, a place where they can feel secure and have a chance to build a better life. Yeah, you're right. It's easy to focus on the negative, but there's always hope. Even after something as awful as this fire, there's always a chance for things to get better.
Definitely. It's about finding those little bits of hope in the midst of all the bad stuff. It's about recognizing how strong people can be, how they can bounce back from even the worst things. And, that photo of the building, it just keeps coming back to me. The fact that it's still standing, it's almost like a symbol or something.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like even though there was so much destruction, life goes on. It's a reminder that things can change, that we can adapt. And I think it says a lot about the community, too. They didn't give up. They rebuilt. They created something new out of something that was lost.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And, this deep dive, it's really been something we started with a fire, but we ended up talking about so much more. Social inequality, the justice system, mental health, trauma, and how we can make things better.
Yeah, it's amazing how one event can lead to so many different conversations. It just shows you that history is more than just dates and facts. It's about people and their lives, their struggles and their successes.
And it's about learning from the past. Not just so we don't repeat the same mistakes, but also so we can be inspired by the people who came before us, the people who faced incredible challenges and still managed to find a way forward.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our look at the Pomona Hotel fire, I want to leave you with one last thought. This event, it was a terrible tragedy, but it can also be a call to action. It forces us to ask ourselves some really tough questions.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of questions?
Well, like, are we really doing enough to help the people who need it most? Are we building communities where everyone has a chance to succeed, no matter who they are or where they come from? Are we learning from our mistakes and working to create a future where things like this don't happen anymore?
Those are big questions. And I think they're questions we should all be thinking about, not just because of the Pomona Hotel fire, but because they affect all of us.
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility to make the world a better place. And I think the first step is to ask ourselves those tough questions and then start looking for answers.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and that you'll keep thinking about these issues even after the episode is over. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a better world.